In July 1943, German engineers at Kummersdorf examined a captured T-34 and wrote a report that ended with this assessment: a tank so poorly built, so roughly finished, so mechanically inferior that it bordered on the primitive. Sloppy welds, a transmission that required the strength of 2 men to shift, an air filter that let dust straight into the cylinders, an electrical system that shorted in the rain. They weren't wrong about any of it. 18 months later, those same German engineers were trying to figure out why that primitive tank kept showing up everywhere on the Vistula, at Lisau, in the streets of Warsaw, long after every calculation said it should have been dead. The Panther outgunned it. The Tiger outarmored it. The German crew was better trained. The German tank commanders had more experience, and none of it was enough. The answer wasn't in the steel. It was in the man sitting in the front left seat of the T-34, the one the Soviets called the mekhanik-voditel, the mechanic driver. His job wasn't just to drive. His job was to keep the tank alive when nothing else could. He carried a sledgehammer. He spliced wires by feel in the dark. He changed tracks under artillery fire. He coaxed engines rated for 200 hours past 300, past 370. He understood something about that rough, leaky, imperfect machine that the Kummersdorf engineers missed entirely. A tank that could be fixed with wire and a hammer and a man who refused to stop was a different kind of weapon than anything Germany ever built. This is the story of how that worked. The T-34 started life with a problem so fundamental it nearly killed the whole program. Mikhail Koshkin, the lead designer at the Kharkov locomotive factory, had fought for years to get his tank built. His design called for a diesel engine at a time when every tank in the world used gasoline. It called for sloped armor when everyone else was building vertical plates. It called for wide tracks when German tank doctrine assumed narrow ones. The Red Army's technical board rejected the first prototype 3 times. Koshkin drove it from Kharkov to Moscow in February 1940 to prove it worked. 2 vehicles, winter roads, 700 kilometers, and the drive nearly killed him. He died of pneumonia that September, 6 months before his tank went into mass production. The T-34 that rolled off the line in 1940 and 1941 was extraordinary in some ways and genuinely terrible in others. The 45 mm hull plate, sloped at 60 degrees, created the equivalent of about 90 mm of vertical protection, enough to bounce German 37 mm and 50 mm rounds at range. The 76.2 mm gun could punch through any German tank then in service. The Christie suspension gave it 45 km per hour on good ground. The diesel engine, the V2, a 38, 8-liter aluminum block V12, producing 500 horsepower, didn't catch fire the way gasoline engines did. German tankers in 1941 watched burning T-34s and were confused when they didn't explode. They'd never fought a diesel-powered tank before. The bad parts were just as significant. The transmission came from the BT tank series, a pre-war design with 4 forward gears that were completely unsynchronized. Shifting required the driver to match engine RPM to road speed with mathematical precision, not guesswork, not instinct, actual precise timing, or the gears refused to mesh. In combat, at speed, crossing rough terrain, with shells landing nearby, this was close to impossible. Most drivers ran in second gear and stayed there. Theoretical top speed was 45 km per hour. Actual combat speed was closer to 15. American engineers who evaluated a T-34 at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1943 described the gearbox in their official report as having gears that were poorly finished, with cogs showing evidence of having completely fallen to pieces, not from combat, from normal use. The clutch required what the Aberdeen testers called superhuman strength to operate. There's nothing figurative about that description. Drivers who managed the clutch incorrectly either didn't move at all or threw a track. Veterans described the physical strain of a long march as genuinely exhausting, not from stress, from the mechanical labor of operating the controls. The air filtration system, designated the Pommern filter, let dust pass the seals directly into the cylinders. On the steppe, where the T-34 fought most of its battles, dust and powdered soil were as constant as heat. An unfiltered engine on the steppe was an engine with a finite countdown. The electrical system ran on two separate circuits, 24 volts for the starter motor and turret traverse, 12 volts for instruments, lighting, radio, and intercom, both generated by equipment from the Dynamo factory in Moscow. The turret traverse motor overloaded under normal use and threw sparks. Poor weld seams at hull joints let water into the interior, and water found wiring. Rats in the repair yards chewed through harnesses. In winter, lubricants in the switch contacts froze. The Aberdeen tests found that after 72 hours of operation, the engine failed a tank that lasted 3 days. Here is what the Germans built in response. The Panther Panzerkampfwagen V came out of a specific shock in the summer of 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. German anti-tank guns bounced off T-34s at close range, and the commanders needed something that could fight back. The Design Bureau produced the Panther by 1942-45 tons, an 80 mm frontal plate sloped at 55 degrees, a 75 mm high-velocity gun that could kill a T-34 at 1,500 meters. The frontal armor was effectively 140 to 148 millimeters against incoming shells. The T-34 76's 76.2 millimeters gun could not penetrate it from the front at any combat range. Even the upgraded T-3485 with its new 85 millimeters gun needed to be within 500 meters to kill a Panther from the front under ideal conditions. The Panther's gun, meanwhile, could kill a T-3485 at 1,500 meters through the front and 2,000 meters through the side. Hitler ordered 250 Panthers for Operation Citadel. The Kursk offensive and Guderian told him they weren't ready. The Panther Regiment von Lauchert arrived at the assembly area in June 1943 with 200 vehicles. 2 Panthers caught fire during unloading from the trains, not from combat, but because the gearbox generated heat when running, and the fuel lines weren't properly sealed, and the result was fire on the flat car. By July 5, the day the offensive began, roughly 40 of those 200 Panthers were operational, 80% mechanical attrition before a single Soviet shell was fired. The transmission, the AK-7-200, failed at a rate of 5% within the first 100 kilometers, and after 1,500 kilometers, over 90% had failed. The Maybach HL-230 gasoline engine overheated so consistently that engineers derated it from 700 to 580 horsepower in November 1943, not to improve performance, but to slow the rate of breakdown. Soviet engineers who tested a captured Panther at Kubinka found the engine failed after 13.9 hours of operation, compared to the T-34's 72 hours at Aberdeen. The final drives, the gears connecting the transmission to the drive sprockets, were made from steel, with a carbon content between 0.63 and 0.75%. Anything above 0.5 makes steel brittle. Germany had run out of the alloy metals needed for proper armor-grade steel by 1944, and the substitution showed up most visibly in the Panther's final drives, which cracked under stress with a sound veterans described as a rifle shot. Roughly half of all Panther abandonments in 1944 were attributed to final drive failure rather than combat. The Panther was not a bad design. It was a design that assumed manufacturing conditions Germany no longer had, while the T-34 was designed from the beginning for the manufacturing conditions the Soviet Union actually possessed. The Ural Tank Factory in Nizhny Tagil evacuated there piece by piece from Kharkov in the autumn of 1941, reassembled in a building where workers slept on the floor because the city had no housing, produced T-34s with whatever quality of steel arrived that week, assembled by workers including teenagers and women who had never seen a factory floor 6 months earlier. Tolerances were loose, finishes were rough, welds were uneven. Some tanks left the factory so poorly adjusted that the tracks threw themselves on the first corner. None of that mattered if the tank could be fixed in a field by one man with basic tools. Koshkin's team had built repairability into the T-34 at the design stage. Track pins required no locking mechanism, a hammer and a spare pin was enough to replace one. Track links were bolted to the hull exterior as standard equipment. The compressed air backup starter meant a dead battery didn't strand the crew. The engine access panel across the entire rear deck could be removed without tools and replaced quickly enough that field depots could swap an engine in hours. Veterans strapped entire spare transmissions to the engine deck before going into battle, not because the transmission would fail, but because they knew it might, and they planned for it. The man responsible for all of this was the mechanic driver. His official designation was mekhanik-voditel. In the four-man T-34, 76 crew, commander, gunner, loader, mechanic driver, he occupied the front left seat and had primary responsibility for everything mechanical. Pre-war training took 2 years and rotated crews through every position. Wartime compressed that to months, sometimes weeks, but the job description never changed. Drive, maintain, diagnose, repair, in that order and sometimes simultaneously. The toolkit carried inside a T-34 included a sledgehammer, and this was not an informal addition, it was standard issue. The sledgehammer's primary use was the transmission. When a driver couldn't force the gearbox into a gear which happened constantly on rough terrain or at speed, a loader could lean over and strike the shift lever hard enough to force the gear into mesh. This sounds improvised, but it was doctrine. Soviet crews called it the normal way to change gears in a hurry. Vasily Pavlovich Bryukov, who commanded T-34s from Kursk to Berlin and destroyed 28 German tanks, described the mechanic driver's importance in terms that stripped away any romanticism. A good mechanic driver was worth more to a crew than a gunner. You could train a man to aim a gun in weeks. You could not train a man to feel that engine in weeks. What Bryukov meant was this. The V2 diesel communicated its condition through vibration and sound in ways that instruments didn't capture. An experienced mechanic driver felt a change in the harmonic resonance of the hull before the oil temperature gauge moved. He heard a beginning roughness in the exhaust that told him a cylinder was losing compression. He knew from the resistance in the steering levers whether the clutch was about to throw. He prevented breakdowns not by reacting to them, but by feeling them coming. And when prevention failed, he repaired. On the 21st of October 1943, a T-34 named Boyevaya Podruga Fighting Girlfriend moved into its first combat position near Smolensk and the mechanic driver was a woman. Mariya Oktyabrskaya was 38 years old, from the Crimea, the wife of a commissar named Iosif Perederiy, who was killed near Kiev in August 1941. She learned about his death by letter. She sold everything she owned: furniture, clothes, savings, and wired the proceeds to the State Defense Committee with a request. She wanted to donate a T-34 to the Red Army, and she wanted to drive it. The request reached Stalin personally. He approved it with one line. She trained for 5 months at the Omsk Tank School. Her instructors initially assumed she was a political gesture and treated her accordingly. After 2 months, she was performing maintenance diagnostics faster than any other student in her class. She understood the V2 engine not as a mechanical system to be memorized, but as something closer to an organism that communicated its state to anyone patient enough to listen. Her final evaluation graded her mechanical aptitude as exceptional and her driving as above average for a combat-ready crew. She arrived at the 26th Guards Tank Brigade in September 1943 with her T-34, her name painted on the side in white letters, her kit bag containing personal tools she'd bought at a market in Omsk with money her sister had sent. Her first engagement on October 21 ended when a German anti-tank round severed the left track. Her commander ordered her to stay inside. German infantry was within 300 meters, but she ignored the order, climbed out, and began work on the track with her kit. She reconnected the broken link, replaced the thrown pin, climbed back in, and drove the tank out of the kill zone under fire that killed 2 infantrymen standing 30 meters from her hull. The operation took 11 minutes. She was promoted to sergeant. On November 17, at Novoye Selo near Vitebsk, the track was destroyed again by artillery. She and a crewmate exited under machine gun fire, repaired the damage using links from the external supply, and rejoined the advance. The engagement lasted 2 days and ended with her tank accounting for German positions, including machine gun nests and a field fortification. On the 17th of January 1944, near Krinky, during a night attack, her tank destroyed German machine gun emplacements, infantry trenches, and a self-propelled gun before an anti-tank round struck the left track again. She climbed out for the 3rd time and was hit by shell fragments while working on the track. She fell into a coma and was evacuated, never regained consciousness, and died on the 15th of March 1944 at a military hospital in Smolensk. On the 2nd of August 1944, the Soviet government awarded her the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously, the first female tanker to receive the honor. What matters about Oktyabrskaya's story for this history is not the biographical drama, but the tactical logic. Every time that T-34 went down, the logical response was to leave it and move. She didn't. The repair took minutes, not hours, not days, minutes, because the T-34 was built to be repaired quickly by one person with tools that fit in a kit bag. The tank's designers had made that possible, and she made it real. The same logic, applied to the engine rather than the track, produced results that look statistically impossible on paper. Guards, Starshina Iosif Antonovich Perederiy, was born in 1913, a mechanic driver in the 66th Guards Tank Brigade. He was not famous. His record exists primarily in an award document filed at the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation file reference CAMD-RF 3379375636, and, in the language of that document, it reads more like an engineering report than a military citation. From January 27 to the 20th of June, 1944, operating on the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, Perederiy drove his T-34 T-3485, a total of 2,700 kilometers over 370 engine hours without a single emergency stop or mechanical failure requiring external repair, on a V2 engine with a rated service life of 200 hours. The document notes that this was achieved through what it describes as loving and scrupulous treatment of technology, a phrase that appears in the Soviet military's award vocabulary as a specific technical designation, not poetry. It meant scheduled oil changes performed on time regardless of combat tempo. It meant attention to the air filtration that most drivers ignored until the engine choked. It meant listening to the engine during every march and making small adjustments, fuel mix, valve timing, cooling that individually had no measurable effect and cumulatively extended the life of the machine by 85%. Then, from January 15 to the 2nd of February 1945, on the First Belarusian Front, Perederiy drove tank number 392, another 1,680 kilometers over 310 engine hours again without breakdown. His combat record during these periods included 2 Panzer IVs destroyed, roughly 20 trucks, approximately 100 infantry, and a 30-cart supply column. The significance of this record isn't that Perederiy was exceptional in some unrepeatable way. It's that the T-34's rated service life was a conservative guarantee, not a ceiling. The ceiling was substantially higher if the mechanic driver knew what he was doing. The guarantee was built for the average driver who had been trained in 3 months and might not know the difference between an air filter that needed cleaning and one that needed replacing. Perederiy knew the difference. He ran a 200-hour engine for 370 hours, the way a skilled machinist runs a cutting tool past its rated life, by understanding exactly what rated life actually measures. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union. The nomination form, translated from Russian, states that his achievement demonstrates both combat valor and mastery of machinery, treating the two qualities as equivalent. That phrasing was unusual for a military citation, and it was accurate. By the time the T-3485 entered service in the spring of 1944, Soviet tank crews had 2 years of experience fighting Panthers and had developed a body of tactical knowledge specific to that encounter. The knowledge was hard-bought. The early records of T-34, 76 crews encountering Panthers in late 1943, are not flattering to the Soviet side. Veterans described the experience as hunting panthers in cornfields and tree lines, afraid to engage frontally, waiting for the geometry to change. Nikolai Yakovlevich Zheleznov, a T-34 commander, described it plainly in an interview collected by historian Artem Drabkin. Prior to that, we had to run like rabbits and look for an opportunity to turn and get at the flanks. The Panther's 80 mm frontal glacis at 55 degrees was effectively impenetrable. The side hull was 40 to 50 mm, unsloped, vertical steel. At 500 meters, the T-3485's 85 mm BR-365 round went through it with energy to spare. The rear plate was 40 mm. The turret mantlet had a curved geometry that created what ballistics engineers called a shot trap rounds that hit the lower curve, could deflect down into the 16 mm roof plate of the hull, and Soviet tankers described that angle as killing a man through his hat. In open ground, hitting the Panther's flanks required closing the distance and getting around it, which required surviving long enough to do so. In urban terrain, in forests, at night, in ambush positions prepared before the German advance, the geometry was controllable. Soviet tactical doctrine after Kursk reflected these lessons in explicit language. Field manuals from 1944 specify that T-34 commanders encountering Panthers should seek flanking approaches at no more than 500 meters, use smoke to close distance, and exploit terrain that prevents the Panther from rotating its hull to face the threat. The Panther's 4 km/h reverse speed was treated as a tactical vulnerability. It couldn't back away from a close threat fast enough to maintain a safe engagement distance. Ion Lazarevich Degan was 19 years old in July 1944, a T-3485 commander in the 2nd Guards Tank Brigade, operating during the East Prussia offensive. His battalion ran into a Panther ambush at night. Germans fired illumination flares, and Panthers systematically destroyed Soviet tanks that were caught in the open, silhouetted against darkness. Degan maneuvered around the right flank, using the burning hulks of his own battalion as cover and illumination, and found Panthers whose crews had their attention fixed on the vehicles ahead. He described shooting them from the side at ranges under 300 meters, each hit on the thin side plate a clean kill. 3 T-3485s survived that engagement from a battalion that had begun the night with 20. Degan's career total by war's end was 12 German tanks destroyed, among them 1 Tiger and 8 Panthers. He had taken what Zheleznov called running like rabbits and turned it into something deliberate, controlled exposure, patience for the angle, speed of decision at the moment the geometry was right. German planners understood the Panther's mechanical problems. They understood the Panther was difficult to repair in the field. The final drives required specialized tools, and 2 men to replace it couldn't be done by a single crew under fire. The transmission needed depot-level facilities. Engine replacement required a crane. When a Panther broke down, it needed recovery by a specialized vehicle, a Berge Panther or a Famo half-track, and transport to a field workshop with proper equipment. The recovery vehicles were chronically in short supply. Abandoned Panthers were common enough that German after-action reports began categorizing losses specifically as material losses due to non-enemy causes to distinguish them from combat kills. Soviet tank recovery and repair operated on a different philosophy. Brigade equipment companies staffed with mechanics drawn from the tank factories in the Urals established repair points 8 to 10 kilometers behind the front line. These weren't workshops in the conventional sense. They were men with truck-mounted equipment and the specific knowledge of one type of engine and one type of vehicle, working in shifts. They could replace a V2 engine in hours. They could rebuild a transmission in a day. They cannibalized wrecked vehicles routinely at Prokhorovka in July 1943. Repair crews salvaged 45 engines and 20 gearboxes from destroyed T-34s within the first 72 hours after the battle. Of 420 T-34s damaged at Prokhorovka, repair crews returned 112 to service within days. Not perfect, not fully restored, but working. By 1944, the production numbers told a story that no tactical innovation could alter. Soviet factories produced between 1,200 and 1,300 T-34s per month. German factories produced 380 Panthers per month at peak output in July 1944. For every Panther Germany fielded, the Soviet Union put roughly 3 T-3485s in the field. The overall ratio for the entire war was more than 8 to 1 inch the T-34's favor across all variants. The T-3485 alone outnumbered the Panther's total production by better than 3 to 1. A Panther that destroyed 4 T-3485s before being knocked out was a tactical success and a strategic defeat. Germany's manufacturing capacity could not replace it. The Soviet Unions could replace all 4 T-34s it had killed and send them back in days. The T-34 didn't need to be better than the Panther. It needed to be good enough, repairable enough, and numerous enough, and it was all three. The most documented single engagement between T-3485s and Panthers in the archival record happened on January 12 and 13, 1945, near the village of Lisau in Poland. During the opening day of the Vistula-Oder offensive, Colonel N. Zhukov commanded the 61st Guards Tank Brigade. His brigade had between 40 and 65 T-3485s. Against him was the German 424th Heavy Tank Battalion, equipped with roughly 29 Tiger I heavy tanks and 23 Tiger IIs, the King Tiger, reinforced by Panthers and self-propelled guns. Zhukov's crews had spent the previous week in concealed positions studying the approach ground. They knew where the defiles were, where the anti-tank ditch ran, where the German tanks would be channeled by the terrain. When the German advance came, it came into ground that T-3485 gunners had already ranged. The 61st Guards destroyed 5 Tiger IIs, 7 Tiger Is, and 5 Panthers, while losing 4 T-3485s, burned total losses, irretrievable, with roughly 10 more knocked out and repaired. Near the Vistula crossing, 2 T-3485s, under Senior Lieutenant Tokarev and Lieutenant Kranov, took up an ambush position and engaged a column of 20 German tanks, including Tigers and Panthers. They destroyed 14 German tanks from 500 meters before the column retreated. Tokarev accounted for 8 and Kranov for 6, and both received the Hero of the Soviet Union. The arithmetic that made this possible wasn't courage or skill alone. It was the repair record that preceded the engagement. Every T-3485 that Tokarev and Kranov drove into their ambush position had been patched, tuned, adjusted, and kept running by men like Perederiy and Oktyabrskaya and 10,000 unnamed mechanic drivers who treated an imperfect machine as a problem they could solve with wire and time and the right hands. Senior Sergeant Petr Egorovich Ruski, born 1921, mechanic driver of the 111th Tank Brigade, had already driven 1,300 kilometers, over 305 engine hours, when his tank caught fire during street fighting in Guben in April 1945. He had already been concussed once in the previous 3 days. The medics had cleared him to return to duty. He was in the driver's seat when the tank was hit by an anti-tank round that penetrated the rear and started a fuel fire in the engine compartment. According to the award documentation at CAMDRF 3379375,641, Ruski told his commander he wanted to remain at his post and destroy the enemy for as long as his heart kept beating. He drove the burning tank forward through the German position, crushing infantry under the tracks and driving through the position they had held. Then he opened the driver's hatch and accelerated driving at top speed with the hatch open, using the rush of air through the interior to blow out the fire, and it worked. He drove the tank to the brigade repair point under its own power and was in the repair queue by nightfall. The award nomination describes this action in the same tone as Perediriy's combat valor and technical mastery, treated as the same quality, expressed in the same man on the same day. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 7th Panzer Division in 1941 and the 5th Panzer Army at the Bulge, in 1944, stated in a post-war assessment that the T-34's crew represented a quality the German command had systematically underestimated. His specific observation was that Soviet tank losses in engagements like Prokhorovka looked catastrophic in the immediate accounting, but that the Red Army recovered damaged vehicles and returned repaired crews to battle faster than any rate the German experience of tank warfare had anticipated. Guderian's post-war memoir addressed the Panthers' mechanical failures directly and without diplomatic softening. He had warned in 1943 that the tank wasn't ready for Kursk. He was overruled. The subsequent performance, 80% mechanical attrition before combat, an offensive that failed within a week, validated everything he had written. What he didn't address was why the T-34, inferior in so many measurable ways, continued to be effective against the machine that had been specifically designed to replace it. The answer was in the repair points 8 kilometers behind the line, in the sledgehammer standard issued to every crew, and in the hero of the Soviet Union citation that described mechanical mastery with the same language as killing. Vasily Bryukov survived the war with 28 tank kills. He described the Eastern Front in his memoir Red Army Tank Commander with a clarity that no technical document quite captures. He wrote about a specific afternoon in Ukraine during the Jassy-Kishinev offensive in 1944, hunting a panther through a cornfield tall enough to hide his hull. He had spotted the panther's antenna moving through the corn 400 meters ahead. He stopped his engine and waited, letting the panther cross the track intersection where the corn was cut and the flank was exposed for approximately 4 seconds. He hit it once in the side. It stopped burning almost immediately, which he took as evidence the crew had gotten out. He moved forward and found the panther with a clean hole through the side plate and 3 crew members in the corn behind it, 2 of them alive, 1 dead. He wrote nothing else about that engagement, no reflection, no moral weight, no assessment of what it meant. The next paragraph was about a fuel shortage 3 days later. That matter-of-factness, that description of finding a geometry, exploiting a geometry, and moving on, is the authentic voice of T-34 combat. The same voice that described splicing a wire by feel in the dark and coaxing 370 hours from a 200-hour engine, and the same voice that described buying personal tools at a market in Omsk because the standard kit wasn't quite enough. The Panther killed more T-34s per engagement than the T-34 killed Panthers. Every technical comparison, every loss ratio study, every post-war assessment confirms that. The Panther was the better individual weapon, and the Soviet Union won anyway. It won because a tank that breaks down and gets repaired in the field is more useful than a tank that can't. It won because 57,000 T-34s built in factory conditions the Germans would have considered unacceptable is worth more than 6,000. 500 Panthers built with tolerances the Germans were proud of. It won because the mechanic driver who understood his engine well enough to run it 85% past its rated life was in every sense more decisive than the superior armor he was facing. Germany built a tank for perfect conditions. The Soviet Union built a tank for actual ones, muddy, cold, wired together, driven by a man with a sledgehammer who wasn't going to stop until his heart did. Mariya Oktyabrskaya's T-34 went into battle after the war ended, in a different way. The Soviet government manufactured a commemorative postage stamp bearing her portrait in 1960. Her name is on a street in Omsk near the school where her tank was built. The Boyevaya Podruga was repaired after she was evacuated and returned to service, and its fate after the spring of 1944 is unrecorded in any file that survives. Iosif Perederiy, the mechanic driver who loved his engine past what the specifications said was possible, survived the war and returned to civilian life. His specific post-war biography isn't in the public record. He is present in the archive as a name, a file number, and a distance, 2,700 kilometers on an engine rated for less than half that, without stopping. Georgy Krivov, a T-34 veteran interviewed by Drabkin, described the mechanic driver's philosophy in 5 words that appeared to be an afterthought in a longer answer about something else. To stop is to die. He meant it about the tank. He meant it about the war. He didn't mean it as philosophy. He meant it as maintenance doctrine,